Hello and welcome to the Witchy podcast with me, your host and Akashic Witch, Kyleanna. Join this space where we sod the shoulds and embrace spiritual freedom. So let's dive in and discover all things witchy and woo.
Witchy woo!
Hello and welcome back to episode 3 of season 4 of the Witchy Woo podcast. And today is a special episode. It's one of the episodes that I absolutely adore. It is one of our true crime style witch trial stories. And I feel like there are some stories throughout history that just stay with you. And that is why I like to tell these stories, because these are all stories of predominantly women who at the time didn't have a voice. And so in us sharing their story as part of this podcast, I like to think that we are giving them the voice, a voice of reason, one that isn't as judgmental or isn't judgmental at all, rather than what they were subjected to while they were here on earth. And a lot of the stories, they're not always shocking, although some of them really are. And that includes this one. This one is quite a shocking one. And I hope that in listening, you will sit with it and realize that actually a lot of these stories were never about witchcraft anyway. They were about fear and power and money and control. And women who didn't fit neatly into the version of womanhood that society preferred them to fit in. They didn't fit into the conventional box. And this particular story feels like one of the clearest examples of that. Because in medieval Ireland in 1324, there was a wealthy woman named Alice Kyteler. I hope I'm saying that right. But Kyteler was accused of sorcery, heresy, demon worship, poisoning her husbands, and sleeping with a demon called Robin Artisan, which, I mean, I know I shouldn't laugh at these stories, but you kind of think, Robin Artisan, does that really sound like a demon to you? Or does it sound like some kind of singer in like a pop band or something? But anyway, what makes this story really quite haunting isn't just the accusations that were made. It's that whilst Alice herself managed to escape, another woman did have to burn in her place. And as I was researching this case, the more that I was looking into it, I just kept thinking, like, oh my God, women really have always been punished for making other people, predominantly men in power, feel uncomfortable. So today we are diving into the story of Alice Kyteler, as I say, and she was the first known witchcraft prosecution in Ireland, and probably one of the most politically messy, fascinating and dark witch trial stories in history. Let's start before Alice became the witch that she was accused of being. Because history does this thing where it flattens women into one thing. It makes them the villain, the seductress, the witch, the madwoman. But real people are, as we know, always much, much more complicated than that. We aren't just the labels that are placed onto us or what society expects us to be or how it likes to fit us into boxes. And Alice was likely born sometime in the 1260s. Obviously, any time that we look into any of these cases, with them going and dating so far back, there's just no possible way of knowing exact details because obviously records weren't kept as well. But as far as I can research back to, it's likely the 1260s. And she was born into a wealthy merchant family in Kilkenny, which at the time was a thriving medieval town. And there was money there, there was trade there, there was influence there. And this does matter in terms of this story, because Alice wasn't some kind of isolated woman who was hidden away in the woods making potions. She grew up around business, around contracts and property and money and power and all of those things. And so she understood how the world worked. And I think women understanding power has always frightened those men in power a little bit. I say a little bit, a lot. Especially in a world where women were expected to be quiet, to be obedient, and also dependent on men for survival. Because Alice wasn't really any of those things. And over time, she became very wealthy through her marriages. Now, this is where people started whispering and making judgments and gossiping about Alice, because she had 4 husbands. And every single one of them had money, land, or status. So the names of her husbands were William Outlaw, Adam LeBlond, Richard Duval, and finally Sir John Lapoa. And with every single marriage, Alice became more and more wealthy and more connected and more powerful as well. And obviously nowadays, no one would really blink an eye at someone marrying more than once. But in medieval Europe, especially for a woman, repeatedly outliving husbands whilst gaining money and property from them was absolutely going to be the subject of gossip. And of course, living in the times that she did, becoming a witch came up a lot. And especially because widows were seen as quite unsettling. A widow suddenly had freedom, she had financial control, she had influence, and historically, society has always been a bit weird around women who don't need permission from men, women who can live in their own rights and take care of themselves, make decisions for themselves. That is very much seen as a threat to the order of things. And I don't really think that that's changed all that much from today. Like even today, women who are successful or they're outspoken or financially independent often get treated differently. You know, they might get called intimidating or cold or difficult or arrogant, or that term that people like to call them, a bitch. You know, they're seen as a bit too much. And I imagine that Alice was probably too much. And as I'm saying too much, I'm doing quotation marks with my fingers, but you obviously can't see that. But anyway, they probably thought that Alice was too much for a lot of the people that she was around. And then her 4th husband, who was Sir John Lapoa, became ill. And that's when things really started to spiral for Alice. His children from a previous relationship apparently became quite suspicious of Alice. They believed that she was poisoning him and trying to secure inheritance and wealth for herself. And honestly, when you look at witch trial history properly, this is how so many accusations began. Now, obviously, we don't know either way what was happening, but the fact that she was accused of this, we all know that doesn't go well for a woman, especially a widow woman. And you can see where these accusations came from, you know, because there were money disputes, inheritance disputes. There may have been resentment or fear or illness or family tension, and women that people already disliked or distrusted were often main targets. And the complaints eventually reached Richard de Ledreed, I think I'm saying that right, Richard de Ledreed, the Bishop of Ossory. And finally, this man seemed absolutely determined to root out evil. And again, I'm doing my I'm doing my finger quotations again around evil. He was, severe. He was deeply religious. He was obsessed with stamping out heresy. And Alice became the perfect target for him because she represented everything that medieval patriarchal society distrusted and disliked. She was a wealthy woman. She was an independent woman at that. She had influence. She had survived multiple husbands. And she was a woman who clearly wasn't interested in shrinking herself to make other people feel comfortable. And so the accusations against her became absolutely wild. She was accused of denying Christianity in secret, of consulting with demons, of making magic powders, of creating love potions, of causing sickness and death, of performing dark rituals and having a demon lover, as I mentioned earlier, named Robin Artisan. And there were even accusations involving strange ointments and sacrifices. And when you read through the charges now, they sound like the blueprint for every witch trial that came after Alice's. But one really important thing to remember is that most of these confessions, again, I'm doing my finger quotations around the word confessions, came from servants and associates being interrogated under the pressure of torture. And, I don't know about you, but I know for me, I don't think I could stand very long being tortured. We all know that torture isn't the best method for bringing out the truth. It's the best method for making people talk, but whether or not that's true is a completely different matter. Because, of course, it creates fear. And people will say almost anything to stop that pain. Now, despite the bishop's obsession with prosecuting Alice, this case did not go smoothly for him at all because Alice had status. That is one thing that sets her apart from a lot of accused women. And that is that she did have power and she did have status. She wasn't the old lady with nothing that was rejected by the village. She had that power. She had that status. She had allies. She had money. She had influence. And local authorities weren't immediately willing to destroy one of Kilkenny's most powerful women just because the bishop demanded it. And I say good on them for that. And at one point, the political fighting got so intense that the bishop himself was actually arrested and imprisoned for a short time after clashing with local leaders. So that tells you how huge this case became. The fact that the fate of Alice and what was going to happen to her was placed above the bishop, who obviously was very religious, who was very well regarded. So it just tells you the fact that he was imprisoned for this, how far the local authorities were willing to go to protect this woman because she did have more power than others. And it wasn't just about religion anymore. It was, as it always has been, about power. Church power, social power, male power, financial power. And Alice was not an easy victim for the bishop. Eventually, though, before she could be fully arrested and sentences, she fled. She escaped Ireland, and most historians think that she went to Dublin first and then possibly went on to England. And after that, no one heard anything from her. Nothing at all. There was no confirmed death, there was no grave, there was no certainty at all about exactly what happened to Alice. She simply disappeared from history altogether. And I think that's part of what keeps people fascinated by her story all these centuries later, because history never really got to decide exactly what Alice Kyteler was, whether she was that villain or the manipulator or the scapegoat or the cunning woman or the survivor. Maybe she was a bit of all of them. But whilst Alice did escape, unfortunately, someone less fortunate than Alice did pay the price. And this is the part of the story that really is upsetting.
This podcast is sponsored by The Strange Apothecary, and we are so honoured to be here. If you've ever felt called to tend to your body the way that you tend to your altar, with intention and devotion, with plants that carry their own ancient intelligence, then this is the place for you. I'm Minister Hannah Strange, pharmacist and the Regulated Oracle. I am the founder of The Strange Apothecary, the Ministry of Pharmakeia. Pharmakeia is at the heart of everything that we do, from plant-powered herbal formulations and sacred skincare, crafted for women who understand that the earth is the original apothecary and that healing has always been both science and ceremony. But the ministry extends beyond the shelf. I also lead the Strange Apothecary Foundation because the medicine should reach everyone. Holistic well-being is not a luxury. The Western medicine model has left too many people without access to real healing, and it is my calling to change that. So when you shop with us, you're not just receiving the medicine, you're sustaining the ministry. Come and find us at strangeapothecary.co.uk. The ministry is open.
And it just makes your stomach drop when you're researching and looking into this, because authorities turned their attention towards Alice's servant, Petronilla de Meath. And Petronilla was arrested, tortured and flogged. And of course, as I mentioned, she was the servant. So she had no power, she had no standing, she had no money. So she was an easy scapegoat. She was an easy way to condemn a witch without it being someone in power, like Alice. And under torture, she confessed to helping Alice with magical rituals and claimed that Alice had renounced Christianity and had dealings with demons. And again, we have to remember the reality of torture here, and that confessions under torture are far from reliable. They're simply survival from someone who will say anything to make the pain stop. And throughout history, it was so often the poorer women, the servants, the vulnerable women who suffered the most, because they didn't have these protections in place or, powers from higher sources that were able to help them. They didn't have the protection or the influence or the money. And on the 3rd of May, on 1324, Petronilla de Meath was burned alive in Kilkenny. And this was often recorded as the first execution by burning linked to witchcraft in Ireland. And that's the part of this story that really stays with me, because behind all of the sensational accusations and folklore and mystery, there was a real woman who died horrifically. A woman that we'll never fully hear the true story of. And when you look throughout history, this pattern repeats itself over and over again. The women with power sometimes manage to escape, which I'm not saying is a bad thing. I'm not saying that I think Alice should have been arrested and killed for witchcraft, of course. But it's just so sad how easy it was for the authorities to bring Alice's servant, Petronilla, to, in their minds, justice. We know she was just the scapegoat. But it's so sad that because she didn't have that power or that money, she was just used in that way to put people's minds at ease, to make them feel as though they had weeded out evil that wasn't there. And Alice's son, who was named William Outlaw, was also targeted, but instead of execution, he was fined heavily and forced into public acts of repentance and penance. And again, money shaped survival. He was in an even better position than his mother Alice was, because he was male. So that automatically put him to the top. And not only was he a male, he had power, he had influence, he had money, he had wealth, and he had all of these people behind him. So where Petronilla was literally tortured and burnt alive for being associated with Alice, the own son of Alice, William, in comparison, completely got away with it because of his power. And that's one of the biggest things that this story really does reveal, that witch trials were rarely about magic or witchcraft, and instead they were all about control and inheritance and class and religion and fear and politics, and ultimately punishing women who existed outside of what society considered acceptable, or women who society didn't care about, didn't think were important enough to be able to keep hold of their lives and not be treated poorly, terribly. And that is why these stories matter so much, because they tell us what people fear. And historically, people have often feared women who couldn't be easily controlled, like Alice. You know, I wholeheartedly believe that the people who went after Petronilla, who was Alice's servant, only did so because they could not go after Alice because of her power, because of her wealth. Obviously, she had managed to escape and get away, but that was purely because of the power and the connections that she had. But they did not think twice about taking her servant and persecuting her and torturing her and burning her alive at the stake. This is because they couldn't touch Alice, because she was financially independent. You know, there was fear there around her. There was fear there around women who were intelligent, women who were visible, women who survived. And so many women that I know, that I work with, and including myself as well, still carry the echoes of that now, still carry the witch wound. It's why this whole season is all dedicated to the witch wound. This season is literally called The Witch Files. Why am I like this? And it's all stemming from a place of, we all have the impacts of the witch wound, the impacts of the witch trials that lasted for centuries. And even if you yourself didn't have a past life where you were persecuted, where you were accused, where you were killed for being a witch, the collective energy within the Akash gets added to every time this happens. Every time a woman is feared, every time a woman is judged or brought to persecution, accused of witchcraft, every time that happens, or happened, I should say, the energy got added to the collective. And this witch wound grew larger and larger. So not only did it get handed down generationally through the matriarchal line, from mother to daughter, you were taught to stay safe, taught to stay small, because that way you won't stand out, you won't shine your light, you won't bring attention to yourself, so you won't be in danger. Not only did it pass down from generation to generation, but it also passed down through our soul's history. And every soul that incarnated after the time of the witch trials had this collective energy within them. As I say, even if they weren't persecuted as a witch in the past. But of course, there are so many souls who were, and they still feel the imprints of that today. They still feel the fear of being visible, of potentially standing out, of having wealth, of having power, of having a voice. You know, there's always that fear there of being too much or too loud or too emotional or too successful or too powerful, too visible. And this witch wound that we carry so much didn't just appear out of nowhere. As I said, women learned over generations that visibility could be very dangerous. And this is a story that happened in May, which is the month of Beltane. You know, it's a celebration of fertility, of abundance, of sensuality and life force energy itself. Yet in May of 1324, we see yet another side entirely, that fear of feminine power and the punishment of women who stepped outside of the lines. And that contrast is so sad, because I think so many women are still trying to reclaim parts of themselves that the world has taught them to suppress. So Alice Kyteler vanished from historical records, but her story didn't. And Petronilla's story didn't. And maybe that says something in itself, because throughout history, people have tried to silence women over and over again. And somehow their stories still survive. And there is another beautiful thing that I want to add, because I know that obviously going through these witch trial stories, it can be deeply saddening to think of what these women went through in the past. And it wasn't only women. Of course, there were men that were accused of witchcraft as well, but predominantly women who went through this fear, even if they weren't accused. But the beautiful thing is, just as all of those fears and all of the anxiety around being accused of being a witch was added to the collective energy within the Akash, so too is every single healing story. So every single time that you bring healing to yourself, that you allow yourself to be visible, to shine your light into the world, that you don't sit there and feel the need to make yourself smaller. Every time you step into your energy and own it and reclaim it, you are bringing healing not only to yourself, but you're adding that to the collective energy within the Akash. So you're not only healing yourself, you're healing the future generations as well, and also healing upwards through the timeline, healing those women who weren't able to bring healing to themselves in those lifetimes because their situations didn't allow for it, because they didn't have the power to be able to make those choices. So every single time you work on yourself, you bring healing to yourself and you heal little parts of the witch wound, you are doing it for the collective. And I just think that is the most beautiful thing in the world. And I shall be lighting a candle for Alice Kyteler. This podcast will be released on the 6th of June, 2026. So that evening, I am going to light a candle for Alice and for all of the women and the men who have been persecuted, who have been affected by the witch trials, by the witch wound. And again, add a little bit of healing and loving energy into that candle. So thank you so much for tuning in, for having me in your ears, for listening to the Witchy Woo podcast. And if this episode did resonate with you, I'd absolutely love to hear your thoughts, because these stories open up such important conversations around women, around power, and the echoes that history leaves behind. And if you want to go deeper, don't forget to check out the Patreon, where we'll be sharing extra reflections and extra little bonuses for you. So until the next time, I'll speak to you soon. Thank you so much for listening to the Witchy Woo podcast today. I hope you have loved it just as much as I have loved being in your ears. Be sure to check out all of the links that are in the description below, including Witchy Woo Magic Zine and my Patreon community, if you'd love to dive deeper into the witchy and woo world with me. And please remember to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who you feel may need it. And lastly, most importantly, never forget how amazing, powerful, and magical you truly are. I'll see you in the next episode. Let's keep sodding those shoulds this week.
Witchy Woo!